Good morning or afternoon if you're in Europe. I'm George Frampton, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, and I'm moderating today's program. It's a joint presentation with the European Union on strategies for transatlantic cooperation to decarbonize the steel manufacturing industry. For the world to meet its climate commitments, emissions from heavy industry are going to have to be dramatically reduced. Steel production, which accounts for roughly 8% of all global carbon dioxide emissions, is obviously at the forefront of that challenge. Incidentally, China, which produces more than half the steel now in the world, steel contributes between 15 and 17% of all the country's CO2 emissions. On your invitations to this program is a link to a background paper that the Atlantic Council developed together with the firm Climate Advisors for the EU on this topic. It explores pathways to scale up production of green steel, creation of a global green steel market, and pinpoints opportunities for transatlantic collaboration to begin to support these steps. And we hope some of you may find it useful. But the discussion today is not a review of that paper. It's rather an attempt to look forward based on the recent announcement at the G20 meeting before COP26 of a joint EU-US initiative to reach a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum over the next 2 years, an arrangement that's intended to address both reducing the carbon intensity of steel and at the same time addressing global overcapacity in steel production that gave rise to Trump tariffs on steel imports into the US and the resulting trade war. So we've asked an esteemed group of 5 panelists who are intimately involved in these issues to comment on first steps in this new initiative. How can the discussions combine addressing both overcapacity and decarbonization? Is agreeing on a common methodology for measuring carbon intensity in steel a prerequisite for progress, and who's going to do that, and how quickly can it be done? How can government policies help create a market for green steel, and how is this going to be financed? This event is off the record. We're live streaming to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So we encourage you to post about today's discussion, share it on social media using the hashtag AC Energy, tag us at AC Global Energy. Those who are listening on Zoom may submit questions in the Q&A portal located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. At any time, we'll try to get to at least some and as many as we can. So it's my pleasure to introduce our experts from government and industry on both sides of the Atlantic. Rupert Schlegel-Milch is Acting Deputy Director General, DG Trade, European Commission, Director of America's Agriculture and Food. Greta Peisch is General Counsel of the Office of U.S. Trade Representative. Peter Handley is Head of Unit Energy Intensive Industries and Raw Materials, DG Grow at the European Commission. Kevin Dempsey, President and CEO of the American Iron and Steel Institute. And Erica Mink is Head of All European Government Affairs at ThyssenKrupp Steel AG. So we're very pleased and honored to have all of you with us today to share some perspectives on this important subject. So if I turn first to Rupert, if I may call you so, what do you anticipate are the first steps in this discussion? Who's going to lead it? Is there an agenda? And how do you address overcapacity and greening up the steel industry at the same time? Rupert, I think you're still on.
Yeah, now I got myself unmuted. Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thanks for getting us together here. It's really a very timely discussion, and I'm looking forward to clarify some of the questions and find better answers, maybe, or first answers to some of them. You asked me about the global steel arrangement. I mean, obviously, we started with a a clear objective to lift some of those steel tariffs, which we are now implementing. And if you wish, as one of the pathways forward, not only to get rid of these legacy issues where we're still, by the way, waiting for the US proclamations implementing it. One of the pathways was the GSA idea, if I may say so. And I think your report, the Climate Advisors and the Atlantic Council report on industrial decarbonization raises many other issues, but of course only briefly touches on this issue, and this is why this discussion is maybe even more timely. And what I'd like to say is that we are having a long history here about trying to tackle overcapacity. And also we have a long and longer history now of trying to tackle climate change. I think if you want to look at international cooperation, there's no better place to start between the EU and the US, because we need transatlantic alignment on these issues if we want to tackle those twin challenges. And we have tried that for a while, as you are very much aware, in the Global Forum on Excess Capacity in the OECD. Some of the members have disengaged, making it a less effective instrument. In any case, it doesn't have the kind of agreement or rules that we're looking at now. We also have, and I just mentioned it because most of you will be aware, I mentioned it in passing, is we have a EU Green Deal, which has many components, which you explain in your report, and Peter Handy later will maybe say a few more words on what we're doing in the EU. But the global arrangement is really the attempt to be coherent and effective on the multilateral or on the multilateral bilateral strand. And we have 6 strands of policy there. And I do think we are in good shape on our side in the EU to start this process, because many of these components we have worked on internally, and I'm now wanted to make a few comments on that. The first strand of comments is obviously the question, what is the restricting market access component for non-participants? What that will look like? What I'd already like to say is we have done a lot via the trade defense instruments, including looking at some of the subsidies which relate to overcapacity. And we might do a lot more if we can find innovative ways to deal with these effects which lead to overcapacity. I'd also like to say on the carbon side, we have a flagship product that has been hotly debated in the US, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Again, I think we are also looking forward to how to integrate this particular carbon leakage, if you wish, instrument, fighting carbon leakage into this discussion here. Thirdly, we have very much invested into the hydrogen aspect, which is also gets a good airing in your report. It's one of the issues that is about the domestic incentives or disincentives, where you really want to make progress also on that side. And of course, it's the key basis also for some of the carbon pricing mechanisms and ETS system that we have to foster these new technologies. And finally, we have also talked about investment screening. We will talk about investment screening, which is another part of, I think, controlling the way the industry is structured and from where, with which input they will actually do trade in the future. So that's a little bit more outline of where we are today. I think we're working very hard on a snapshot in the EU to prepare for these negotiations, which will, by the way, as far as we are talking today, led by DG Trade in the Commission. I'd like to also point to the need to look at the instruments which exist on the other side of the Atlantic. And this is why I hope that our US interlocutors today will bring some more clarity or more airing of what the instruments which will be developed in order to be ready for this negotiations or to accompany the negotiations will be. And then, of course, one word I need to emphasize in setting out all of these things is we have a number of challenges here because the WTO rules need to be respected, the proportionality, non-discrimination, and other aspects. So we have to marry these ideas to have, if you wish, kind of a preferential approach, or at least an approach which certainly does not lead to global carbon leakage with those rules. And that is going to be an interesting and complex discussion. We have a deadline by the end of 2023, so we actually, and you asked about that, what's the pathway to that? We will have to, in my view, kick off this discussion rather shortly. And we will also have to deal, I think, with not only the time element, but also the question on how do we deal with the like-minded partners that we are addressing in the agreement that we have with our United States colleagues. So I'll stop here because you wanted us to have a short introduction, but I wanted to set out the horizon as we see it and look very much forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Rupert, thank you. That's very, very complete. I'm going to turn to your one of your counterparts and ask Greta to talk for a few minutes about how you see first steps and how you see the whether standard methodology setting is critical here and how that can happen from a U.S. side if the U.S. participates in that. And thank you for joining us today. Greta, over to you.
Thank you, George, for having me and for putting together this event. I think it is a really useful and, as Rupert said, timely conversation to have. And, you know, I think for us, as far as first steps and thinking about the methodology, you know, one of the, as Rupert said, we were going to need to talk about other countries and what makes sense for expanding out the global arrangement over time. But one of the advantages of having this conversation between the US and the EU right now is because we are, although we have our differences, like-minded in these areas and have similar goals and have high ambitions. And so starting off that conversation about data, about methodologies, sharing our thinking and exploring new ways to think about these issues, I think is an important conversation to have between us before we expand out. And in the global arrangement, that was sort of cast out as the first step. And I think that we see that as the place to start with some of the technical underpinnings here, to have a shared understanding of approaches and methodologies and thinking about ways to move forward. It is a complex area, and I think you know, that 2-year deadline I think is quite ambitious because we are talking about two really big issues that, as Rupert said, we have been dealing with for years and years, and we're very excited to try out this new strategy to really turn the page on first global excess capacity, which has proven to be an intractable problem that we have, the United States has tried to address in a multitude of ways and hasn't come to a solution, as well as carbon intensity. And those two issues do intersect, which is why we're very excited that they're connected in this discussion. So I think there is, to start out, as I said, a lot of technical work to do. We are intensively on the US side undertaking that work to prepare to have that conversation with the EU and kick that off and see where it leads us. And we think it's very exciting.
Thank you. Well, let me turn to Peter. Rupert mentioned carbon contracts for difference as a key tool here, but I guess I'm interested in how you see the timing of this. If hydrogen is a key part of the long-term process of decarbonizing steel, isn't the lack of a hydrogen infrastructure right now going to be a real barrier to making short-term investment decisions? Investment decisions to replace blast furnace integrated steel mills in the next couple of years will be necessary, or at least beginning that decision-making process, if those mills are going to be around 25 years from now. How do you move forward on a hydrogen platform if it's still in hydrogen production and transportation is still in its early days?
Thanks very much, George. I'll come on to those because they're both building blocks in a larger picture. I think the important part to start from is that I think globally, everyone's realized we have a real challenge ahead of us, decarbonizing heavy industries. And the European Union is one of the parties that signed up to the Glasgow breakthroughs at COP26 just a few weeks ago. Of course, in the European Union, we've been working hard on decarbonizing the steel and other energy-intensive sectors for many years. And the thing is, what we have is something which actually makes sure that we do reduce the emissions. We have a cap and trade system, the emissions trading system. So, that actually forces two things. It forces emissions down, and it incentivizes investments in helping to achieve that. But we know it's not enough. So you need other drivers. One driver is research and innovation, and we're putting quite a lot of effort into this, particularly through the Clean Steel Partnership, which has been launched earlier this year. Also through the Innovation Fund, which sits alongside our emissions trading system, and where we've just awarded 1 billion euros worth of large support to leading projects, including the hybrid project in Sweden, which is a green hydrogen project to produce green steel. And we also have the whole hydrogen side of things, where we are collecting projects through the Clean Hydrogen Alliance. In fact, we announced the pipeline of hydrogen projects just a week ago at the Hydrogen Forum. We have 750 projects throughout the value chain, including many which are about decarbonizing heavy industries like steel. And as far as carbon contracts for difference are concerned, this is a tool that is designed to address the fact that clean technologies not only involve higher capital expenditure, they also involve often higher operating costs. And often where there's not yet a mature market for those clean products, which may perform exactly the same way as a classic product. So we have two tools. One exists today, and the other is in the process of being built. It's already possible under the state aid guidelines for energy and environment for member states to grant assistance for the operating costs through carbon contracts for difference. But we realize that not every member state has deep enough pockets to do that. So we've built into our revision of the emissions trading system a proposal that the Innovation Fund should in future be allowed to provide assistance for the best projects that emerge at the European level for carbon contracts for difference. So all in all, we're very busy in this space and looking very much forward to international collaboration on cleaning up the steel sector globally. So looking forward to working with the United States in particular.
Thank you, Peter. Kevin, as you've pointed out to me and others, the United States produces steel predominantly through electric arc furnaces, and so much lower carbon intensity steel. How is that going to have an impact on these discussions, and how do you think the U.S. steel industry sees this as an opportunity, these discussions, or a challenge or a threat?
Well, thank you, George, and good morning. Appreciate the Atlantic Council hosting this event, and glad to be participating in it. You're right, the American industry has already done a great deal to decarbonize. We've moved a substantial portion of our production to electric arc furnace steelmaking, and we're making great strides on our integrated side to reduce carbon emissions through use of innovative iron alternatives like hot briquetted iron, increased use of natural gas in blast furnaces and BOFs, and reducing coal consumption and the like. But obviously, there's much more work to be done. When I think about this new partnership between the U.S. and the EU, I do think the focus on trade measures is appropriate, and the effort to set a new international standard and to ensure that we're incentivizing trade in lower carbon emitting steel. Obviously, methodology is going to be important for that, and I think that's why it's very important that the government start with identifying a common methodology for measuring carbon emissions in steel products. And there are a number of things that are critical to that. One that's going to be very important for that, and it's also going to be very important in standard setting, is to ensure that we remain neutral between technologies, that we do not have rules that favor integrated steel production over electric arc furnace steel production. I know some in Europe like to distinguish between primary and secondary steel production. That's basically discrimination based on technology, and I think would be inappropriate. We really need to say, there's steel, and how do we measure low carbon steel, and recognize there are going to be many different ways that companies and work to reduce their carbon emissions, and we need to have standards and methodologies that are neutral. We also have to make sure that any methodologies to measure carbon emissions take into account emissions at all stages of production, including raw materials and including the transportation of raw materials to steel producers. So that's going to be very important. And then a third aspect, I think, will be to ensure that we account for efforts by steel companies to acquire renewable energy and to further green their supply chain by buying low carbon energy. So that's going to be very important to do. So there's a lot to be done there. The role for government, I think, here is critical. Government plays a role in helping to establish, what are the correct measures and what are the right trade policies to incentivize. Government should be ensuring that there's not discrimination between technologies. But also, I know another part that I think needs to be part of this discussion, and it was sort of referenced just a minute ago, is there are differing approaches by different governments on how much government financing should be provided to decarbonize and for what types of investments. And I think it's going to be critical that we develop a common understanding of where are the bright lines, what's acceptable government role, what's unacceptable. For instance, financing research and development into future breakthrough technologies, future uses of hydrogen and things like that. Absolutely, that's a very important role for government. But government financing of just the building of new steel mills using commercially available technology like electric arc furnace technology today, I think that's inappropriate. That's government investing in currently available technology that should be left to the market. And that's where I think we see the link to the issue of global overcapacity, which is the other part of the US-EU discussion. Because the reason we have the current global overcapacity problem is that many governments around the world have been too active in intervening in their markets and incentivizing investments in particular technologies, and that's led to China massively over investing in steel production. It's leading to increased investments by Chinese companies in Southeast Asia into new steel production that is very high emitting. You just have to look at some of the new stainless steel production in Indonesia. So establishing sort of the ground rules for where it's appropriate for governments to be financing, where it's not appropriate, I think will help to ensure we have a good market, develop a good market for lower emitting steel, and one that does not lead to further overcapacity problems and can in fact help discipline against the types of government intervention that lead to overcapacity. So it's a very ambitious set of objectives that the governments have set out. I think we look forward to working with the U.S. government to assist to provide technical expertise help the governments work through these difficult problems. I agree. 2 years is going to be a fast paced, but I think we do need to do it because obviously the challenges from climate change are critical. And I think the market is driving steel producers all around the world to focus more on reducing their carbon emissions. It's critical for the commercial viability of every steel company. So I think there's a real market-driven incentive to do that. That's why the U.S. industry has been reducing its carbon emissions so significantly over recent years. It's not been a government-driven policy; it's been market-driven. So I think that is going to help us, but we need to make sure that the government roles help promote and incentivize the right market forces and not undermine the work that's being driven by the market today. That through very vigorous competition across technologies and between companies all around the world. So very excited to be here, happy to participate and look forward to your questions.
Kevin, thank you. A couple of suggestions there, rich for discussion, which I want to come back to in just a minute. But first, give Erica opportunity to talk a little bit about the point of view of the steel industry in Europe, and particularly we had a conversation before earlier this morning about who is going to take up the reins first and most foremost in developing a methodology that can find wide acceptance. So I'd like you to mention that as well, Erica. Over to you then.
Yes, thank you very much. And again, also thank you from my side for the opportunity. I think this is an extremely important discussion. And of course, the European steel industry, we very much welcome the agreement on sustainable steel at the achieved and believe, as an important next step. We have to see how we make this work and how we start looking into measurements for carbon intensity of steel. There are international rules and standards available, which we can build on. But from our perspective, the most crucial point is to know that all we do really drives decarbonization, and that it really leads to absolute greenhouse gas emission reductions, so that we drive CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions down with the tools we develop. When it then comes to, and for us, clearly, being working and operating in a jurisdiction with very ambitious climate policies and CO2 reduction targets, which we full-heartedly support. But of course, as you probably know, carbon leakage and investment leakage is an issue for us. So we are not very hooked to to certain instruments, but we really think some sort of border adjustment mechanism will be necessary. Even so, we think we can discuss what the trial period and the time spans, etc. Should be. We would it could be levies, it could be other CO2 charges based on carbon intensity of steel products. But we really think it should be, and we have to discuss then, of course, when it comes to details, what's the scope, what's in scope, what's out of scope, direct emissions and indirect emissions, and perhaps also we should consider perhaps a few other sustainability aspects and criteria going forward. And as several speakers already mentioned, it has to be linked to some sort of mechanism managing and limiting global overcapacities. So we think that it would be helpful if industry and governments got together to see, what is the general criteria for a methodology. We would agree, in fact, that it has to be technology neutral, otherwise it would hamper for and foremost innovation, which is absolutely not in anybody's best interest. We would also, the discussions we are having over here in Europe is that we think it should really be LCA based. It should be based on internationally recognized standards and rules. And we need to have, of course, also mechanisms, for some sort of a proof mechanism. We use standardization. Some of our European companies, including mine, we are working on, we are already starting placing very limited amount of green steel or CO2 reduced steel on the market based on, transparent methodologies and third-party verifications. I really think, when it comes down to the details, those criteria would be very, very important, which is also why the European industry, we work with the European Union and the Commission, but also in Germany specifically, we have a partnership. There is a government-driven work which is called a lead market initiative, where we discuss, how to define green steel in combination with lead market instruments that might be developed in order to drive up the consumption of and the market for green steel. And perhaps this could be even something, one would want to discuss in a wider context. And going forward, I also think it's really important that we start this conversation between the EU and the US. Someone mentioned, not least because we share a lot of common values and principles. But I also think it's important that we find over time mechanisms to include other steel producing nations, and it can be via a climate club being discussed over here quite a bit, and really see how on the long run we use such an initiative also to build partnerships, to build pathways for green steel between different parts and geographies in the world, and also to see, to help how we can build technology partnership and leverage technologies built and developed in some parts of the world for the benefit of others. At the end of the day, we have still one common goal, which is to have, of course, very competitive climate neutral steel businesses, but also, to drive climate and CO2 climate impact and CO2 emissions down globally. So here I would like to pause and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Well, let me pick up on some comments that Kevin made, and your just mention of the carbon club. While obviously the EU CBAM proposal has aroused a lot of nervousness on the part of American business, in the case of steel, of course, since U.S. steel is quite low carbon steel, the issue of CBAM applied to steel is, conceivably could be very favorable, competitively favorable to U.S. And in fact, it's possible to imagine a steel carbon club involving the EU, the US, and countries like Japan and Korea, which I think is probably going to get a lot of discussion, both positive and critical over the next year. But a trade issue that could be more of a problem, which Kevin mentioned, is that the part of the Green Deal, Fit for 55, is major investments that the government has to catalyze or make in greening industry, including green steel, perhaps subsidizing electric arc furnaces, whereas in the US, the electric arc furnaces didn't get made with government money. So the kinds of investments that governments are going to have to make, and particularly the EU is planning to make in greening sustainability, normally would raise some conventional trade issues about subsidies and favoritism. is there openness to addressing these issues on either side, both sides, with some kind of standstill agreements, or recognizing that major green government investments are made for a common purpose, climate purpose, and not for an anti-competitive purpose? How are the discussions going to address those issues? So I guess I would come back to Rupert and to Greta to see if you want to or could have any comments on those issues. Rupert, you're on mute.
Yes, thanks, George. I mean, I think we're still in rather early stages. I mean, there's obviously, for us from the EU side, a question of coherence here. We have already put forward an instrument. We have actually quite, as I said, a number of instruments. We have internally, we have the emissions trading system. Externally, we are trying to develop a tool which will level the playing field, if you wish, because we want to really, in the interest of having global solutions, we want to have a level playing field. How that will figure in our discussions here, I think it's really too early to say. It depends a little bit, first of all, how we further think about the CBAM rollout, because as you know, we have discussions even with the US. Yesterday, the day before yesterday, there was a discussion between our top politicians here, Timmermans and Kerry, on how to deal with these issues and whether there is scope to also, be coherent in our transatlantic relationship, looking at what we have on both sides of the Atlantic, which we all know is very different. There is no carbon price, at least yet, in the US. And how that will figure with our attempts here is just too early to say. It depends a little bit how we want to structure this element that I mentioned in the beginning, or the elements that I mentioned. We have quite a number of issues here to look at in the future that includes the interplay between the various instruments. What I can say is, of course, is that we believe that we should not get into a conflict between these various approaches. They should all have, work towards one synergetic goal, if you wish, which is to help the decarbonization along, and to make also sure that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot by doing so, by basically just incentivizing the rest of the world to continue, the kind of example that were mentioned, that production is moving around in Asia in very carbon intensive ways. We don't want to incentivize that. We want to do the opposite. We want to de-incentivize this sort of behavior.
Greta, happy to give you a moment to comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I'm glad it's come up. I think the question of government incentives and investments in this area is a really important one. And there is an interesting interplay between the two issues we're focusing on: overcapacity and carbon intensity. And you don't want your investments in carbon and lowering in carbon lower sort of production to lead back to overcapacity. And I think we need to have conversations with the EU and with others about how to make investments, how to incentivize carbon, reducing carbon and steel production, and do so in a way that is not market distorting. I think one of the dangers here is that we end up, proliferating electric arc furnaces to a point where we have more capacity there than we need as a world, and that's not a good result either. And we can't meet all of the steel demand through one technology, as has been noted. There has to be a look across the board at all the technologies, and the market plays a role in that. And we have to be careful as governments as we look to supporting the reduction in carbon emissions to do so in a way that is sustainable in the marketplace. We don't want also our companies to look at the investments that are being made and around the world by governments and say, well, I don't know if I can compete, so I'm not going to invest in reducing my carbon emissions, because I don't know, if that investment is going to pay off if there's overcapacity in green steel kind of coming about. So I think we just need to be careful and thoughtful and have that conversation, and think about how the various programs that are under consideration are going to impact all of these different factors. And there's many sort of layers here that will be really helpful to unpack over time.
Peter Handley, I know you have to leave us a little bit early. If you have 1 minute, what about the flip side of that? I mean, Greta mentioned we don't want to overinvest in green steel and increase overcapacity, but all the infrastructure spending is going to happen in the U.S. and in Europe. Is that going to partially solve the problem of overcapacity?
Well, first of all, apologies that I do have to be in my next meeting at 9:45 your time, so I'll give a quick answer.
That's a question from the audience. That's why I asked it right now.
Look, we're all coming out of the COVID mini recession with Build Back Better programs. And a lot of this is about infrastructure, which translates into the need for steel, aluminium, and concrete, amongst other things. So it may, for the duration of these recovery programs, it may help to absorb or conceal the overcapacity, but the overcapacity is still there, and certainly in the Asian region, it's continuing to rise, right? You've also got parts of the world that have programs which are designed to create a constant need to build new infrastructure around the world in ports and railways, you know what I mean? And a lot of that is highly carbon intensive. Now, I totally agree that investments should essentially be driven by the market. But when you're talking about massive breakthrough technologies which have not been proven, you do need to do some de-risking, right? So you have to have an intelligent dosage of public funding to make sure that you take the business case over the line. Otherwise, no one's going to move, right? And I think to get to the first large-scale demonstration of these breakthrough technologies, it takes quite a lot of business courage because there's a high amount of risk involved. The other thing is that, yeah, there's a place for all sorts of steel technologies. Electric arc furnaces are great because they make use of scrap. So it's very much part of the electrification of the sector, and also circularity by using things that came out of previous products. But there are certain functions for which you need to go to the primary process, right? So the key challenge there is for those specialized steels, what's the best pathway to get there and get rid of the fossil fuels in the process? So you're going to need electrification, but you're also going to need other technologies as well.
Erica, I'm interested in whether you how does the European industry see the overcapacity problem, and what's the industry in Europe likely to push for in terms of overcapacity?
Well, I think we have a good set of trade instruments. Of course, we have been very supportive of the safeguards in place at some point, but I think going forward, it will. I mean, I see the steel industry really in this race to zero carbon, and ideally, we would wish to see a fast transition, and to make sure that those companies and geographies are fastest will make that race. So I think we have to really work on environment and sustainability standard to some extent, to see then which investments will be sustainable long term, and which capacities and which not. And I think that's again, it's a discussion that we must have and really see what works. I mean, we are very not very happy that that this a group that was in place on this discussing overcapacities, that some parties left the table. which is very, very unfortunate. And probably we have to also see just how we would get some of these parties back to the negotiation table. And in this context, perhaps, we very much think we need an international CO2 price, are very, very much in favor of putting a price on carbon, but not just within the European Union, but internationally with the key trade partners.
Rupert, let me ask you a question about coming back to border carbon and Carbon Club. Steel is a case where one could certainly argue that protecting against leakage and encouraging decarbonization of the industry globally and protecting a level playing field, the competitiveness of European industry are all pretty aligned. But the targets, of course, will be then restrictions on or prices on high carbon imports from countries that are going to be fiercely opposed to that. So how do you assess how the EU is doing in convincing the global community that if we're going to have real movement toward climate ambition, there are just going to have to be devices to protect against leakage for those who are really doing a good job. In part, it's a sales job to the rest of the world, isn't it? This is not anti-competitive. It's in aid of our all trying to make more progress.
Yeah. No, I think George, you're right. I think we need to, I wouldn't say sell this, but I think we should do all we can to be convincing in what we're trying to do, including that it's for the global good, and that the leadership that we can show here actually leads to a better outcome for everyone. I mean, I would venture to say that none of the governments, even those which have left the Global Forum Excess Capacity, where, by the way, the question of sustainability is also now coming onto the agenda, that they necessarily disagree with the fact that carbon emissions from these sectors should be lower. What they do, of course, see might be different is the trade-off between economic growth, jobs, and so on, and those efforts. And that is something where I think we need to be not only be convincing, but also have ways to help at least those who want to be helped, if you wish. So, and that means that we have to also look at the whole sense that the whole measures or the whole toolbox that we have to talk to third countries, in particular the poorer countries in the world, to also support them in this transition. And then, of course, on the other hand, so you have the discussions, you have also the climate discussions where, as you have seen in Glasgow, things can be done, announcements at least can be made. And then you have the tools on the trade side, which need to be coherent and at some stage will also have to play their role. And that means, and this is the whole logic of this initiative, and to some extent also the logic of CBAM, that you have to have the toolbox which is coherent in all its elements, because if you don't have that, you will see reactions which will try to actually exploit the incoherence in the toolbox, meaning you will just move because of economic reasons, you will just move your production where you don't have these restrictions and you remain competitive, which is what companies, is what companies want to do, obviously. So we have to have a mix of messages and tools to convince the world in the bigger picture that this is part of a good toolbox and that it's not against anyone, but it's also to make sure that we can continue to not only have a viable industry, but also make trade conducive. Trade is not an end in itself, to make trade conducive to the bigger fighting climate change goals.
As I think we all saw at the COP, issues of equity and just transition are are becoming more and more high profile when you think about deep decarbonization. Industries that never really thought they were going to have to go very far by 2050 because they'd still be the last emitters are now facing a transition that looks a little bit more ambitious. So I guess from the US side, Kevin and Greta, how do you think the Biden administration and industry see that as an element in the decarbonization of steel in the U.S.? What are the just transition challenges, and what does industry and the government need to do about that?
Well, George, I'm happy to kick it off there. I mean, obviously there are going to be transition costs for any big change, and so there's a role for government to provide, through unemployment insurance, trade adjustment assistance, and the like, to assist. I mean, the U.S. government is, providing, incentives, buy clean programs that were just announced yesterday to try to incentivize buying of low carbon emitting, products, and I think that can be a tool to help encourage smaller businesses to make those investments, to knowing that they're going to have a market to sell their goods. Creating a market is a big part of, I think, government policy. And I do think where the U.S. and the EU, the key part of their agreement going forward about promoting sustainable steel, creating a club that incentivizes other countries to move to policies that promote lower carbon emitting steel and to take actions to reduce global overcapacity is the right way to go. But the key there, as several people have noted, our previous efforts through the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity have not really been successful because other countries could simply just walk away from the table and there was really no penalty for them to do that. And that's why the provisions in the US-EU agreement to develop standards by which we will restrict market access to other countries that refuse to make these types of reforms, that are continue to incentivize a high carbon steel production, to tell them that their ability to export those products to our markets is going to be limited. That will create a meaningful market-based incentive that I think will help drive other countries to maybe change their policies. But we have to take those steps. We have to move beyond just trade diplomacy to developing trade measures. It's critical that we develop, I think, measures jointly with the EU so that we have a common understanding of a good approach. But I think developing carbon border adjustment mechanisms in steel is something that there'll be broad support for in the industries in both the US and the EU. And so perhaps steel can be the test case on how do you develop an effective trade policy mechanism that gives an advantage to low carbon emitting steel, that discourages carbon leakage around the world. And so that's where I think the very positive news is and where the real focus needs to be going forward.
Let me ask the same question back to Rupert and Erica, and then I want to come back and ask you about Buy Green, Kevin, and the Biden executive order.
Sorry, George, I'm not sure who you're addressing yourself to and what question. Which question?
It's really about how you see the just transition challenge. And perhaps in a way, it may be a little bit easier in Europe because if the major commitment is expenditure of money to create a hydrogen infrastructure, that's a whole nother industry in which long-term jobs are created, both by the construction of the infrastructure and the operation.
No, yeah, I think I think we've already have, as I said, and Peter has said, we're actually having quite a lot of activity and initiatives here. I think in the international arena, at some stage, you might want to come to a kind of what we call green box in trade jargon, a set of things that are okay, which are not trade distorting, and a set of things which are not okay, which are not in the green box, incentives, subsidies, and so on. We have that in other areas, more or less developed. I mean, it's more developed in agriculture. There's very limited disciplines in the industrial sector on subsidies. And there are basically, I think, very few rules which look at this in the international context beyond the agricultural one that I mentioned. But that will be, I think, one of the challenges we have to deal with as we set out to create this, as some of you have said, this very innovative initiative. So I don't have all the answers what such a green box or whether we really that's the only way to do it. But you have to be sure that you are coherent and don't undercut each other with contradicting incentives, etc., etc. Different issues will lead to different outputs, and then you get in the end tension in the trade system because people think what the other side is doing is unfair, and that we need to avoid. It's very clear.
There's an audience question. I was going to come back to you, Kevin. Anyway, how do you create this initial market for somewhat higher priced green steel? It's going to have some kind of probably a price premium. What does, as you mentioned, the President Biden signed an executive order this week. What can the executive branch do that without legislation? And what has to happen on the steel front to actually begin to create a priority in government purchase and government contract at the federal level or at the state level as well?
Well, thanks, George. I definitely think there is a role the government can do to create, when they set their the standards, what products they're looking to purchase for government procurement. They can include, requirements on carbon emissions. They probably have to start with, greater disclosure of carbon emissions embedded in a product. The companies are increasingly developing, environmental product declarations that document their carbon emissions. The state of California has a Buy Clean California program that they're just getting off the ground that tries to do this at a state level. And so it's the first one that's really been started. The biggest problem with the California approach is that they didn't cover all products. They basically covered a couple of steel products and one or two other areas. But for instance, they left out cement. And and I don't know that so to do something like this, I think the one key thing would, of course, be governments would have to apply across the board. You could not simply impose a higher burden on steel products, but not on competing materials, whether it's aluminum or cement or wood. So you'd have to have a common set of rules that can do that. And first of all, there's a lot of work being done in the private sector on that type of disclosure. So I think the government can build on what's already being done at the private sector. But I think that we also need to acknowledge, though, that government procurement is the government only buys a relatively small share of all the steel that's consumed globally. So you're not going to do it all through government procurement. You have to look at other policies. One of the other interesting things in the executive order issued yesterday by the Biden administration was more focus on, promoting zero emission vehicles. And I think that's an area that, governments around the world are very focused on. How do we, since the automotive industry is another major source of carbon emissions, there's a link there to steel because, as you move to, electrified vehicles that reduce very much their direct emissions in the use phase, a bigger part of the carbon emissions associated with automobiles is going to be in the production phase of those cars. And a big part of that is going to be in the production of the key basic materials, steel, aluminum, carbon fiber, other plastics that are used to make steel, so to make the car. So I think it's going to be important that when we think about how do we incentivize and mandate true zero emission vehicles, that they include that production phase and that we have clear government rules on that, because frankly, steel overall is produced with much lower carbon emissions than some of our competing materials like aluminum or carbon fiber. And so, we should be, incentivizing automotive makers to be using the materials that are the lowest carbon emitting in the production phase as well. So that's another way in which I think the government, through policies maybe with respect to automobiles, and they could do it also in construction, will indirectly also incentivize, the market for lower emitting steel production.
A good point, Kevin. Erica, I didn't mean to cut you off if you had a comment on the just transition issue, but I'd also like to ask you the same question about what is industry in Europe, looking to government to do to help create a market for green steel? What do you need for the government to do? What's the role of government in helping to create that market?
Yeah, I just realized, Kevin, I think we're quite close. So what we discussed in Europe is what we call a lead market. Could you create a lead market whereby, for example, green public procurement, as the Biden executive order, is one topic we're discussing. Another is, could there be quotas or some sort of a mechanism whereby you would, step by step increase the percentage of green steel or other, low carbon material, for example, in the car industry. And we have in Europe or in some countries, we have, you have specific programs to support e-mobility. Can we combine those programs with a requirement on green steel? So these discussions are ongoing to really see, what would be the best mechanism in order to help build the market. Because we know, we have today, we still need to scale technologies. We have the solution, as Peter mentioned as well. We have breakthrough solutions. We are ready to go, but we need, to have but these technologies today are not yet cost competitive. So we need to see, but over time, they will be, because it's all comes to economies of scale. But we have to bridge, between today and between the time point when we have reached these economies of scale and have green steel with a price premium. And the price premium taken by the market. So that's one, and contracts for difference. What we are discussing is another tool linked to such lead market initiatives. And to the second point, on the just transition, what we feel is, and we see it, we run a mill with 25,000 employees. And there is a big concern among people. So what is this decarbonization? What does it mean to us? What does it mean, to turn down blast furnaces and build new technologies and new installations? So I think we have still some work to do to make sure, technology alone will not do the trick. We have to bring people along. And this means we have to reskill people. There will be, and this is not just white collar people, this is also blue collar people. And there are programs also in a lot of work done in a European context, and also by the European Union in partnership with industry. But I really think going forward, we have to put much more focus on these aspects as well. Right now, we are very much, technology to scale technologies, to get breakthrough technologies to the market. But at the same time, we have to see, who is going to operate those technologies. We have a shortage on engineers, we have scientists, so there are but also, to reskill blue-collar workers going forward.
Thank you. Well, I think that we're able to go a little bit over the hour, but we're sort of coming to our conclusion here. And I just really want to thank you for participating in this. I know it's not easy when people were about to launch a discussion that is going to tangle with some very thorny issues, which are not new and are not going to be easy to solve, to be part of a public program. But I hope this has been interesting for you, and I certainly hope it's been interesting for our audience. And so thank you, all of the panelists, for taking your time this morning. I want to also thank the European delegation for their support in this event, for climate advisors for their partnership, and those who were involved in organizing today's event: Kelsey Foran, Lizzie Bowen, Maya Sparkman, and Lauren Holland. If you would like to watch or rewatch this panel or share a stream with a colleague, you can find a recording on the Atlantic Council website and the YouTube channel, and a copy of the paper on the Climate Advisors website. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.